Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Exchange 2013 Certificates. Certificates are essential to an Exchange deployment, and Exchange uses self-signed certificates by default. Ultimately, this allows clients to connect in, like your Outlook clients or Outlook web app clients, ActiveSync clients. They connect in, and the server validates that it is the right server. But with a self-signed certificate, there really is no validation that the server is telling the truth. So self-signed certificates, they do work, but they aren't appropriate for a production deployment. And the reason for that is because when you do connect up with an Outlook client or Outlook web app and so forth, you do get some kind of an error, some kind of a warning. And in a browser with Outlook web app, you'll even see a red banner for the address bar as a way of warning you that there's something wrong with the certificate. Now, there's really nothing wrong with the certificate, it's just that it's a self-signed certificate, so there's no third-party validation that the certificate is correct and that the server really is valid. So we need to obtain and install better certs on the Exchange server for a production deployment. That's key if you're going to move your Exchange server from a lab environment to a production environment. Digital certificates accomplish two important purposes. The first is they authenticate to the client that the server with the certificate is trustworthy. And second, they ensure that the data exchange is protected. Now, really, the underlying secure socket layer or SSL mechanisms do this, but the cert helps authenticate the process. So it is essential that we use digital certificates when we're going with a production environment. There are different types of certificates, including the self-signed certificate that is signed by the application itself, and we'll see that in a moment when we actually look at the certificates on our existing Exchange server. Then there's a public key infrastructure that can be set up. This requires setting up certificate servers, and we can do that within our Exchange environment. We can set up Microsoft certificate servers, but really the best option is the trusted third-party certificate, partially because they're provided by a certification authority, a CA, and they're automatically trusted by clients, so the deployment is simplified. And as far as the cost, it's really minimal. To get a certificate like the one that we're going to install on our server, it costs about $80. So depending on your certification authority, the price might vary, but you're not looking at spending thousands on a trusted third-party certificate. Now you'll note when you go to work with the certification wizard in order to start working out the certificate request that we can choose to use a wildcard certificate which can represent multiple domain names. For example, we can use *.spytechprime.com. However, this provides a less secure method because the wildcard can be used for any subdomain. So from a security perspective, this is really not the best solution, a wildcard certificate. It's the easiest because it's a very simple certificate to obtain, but it's really not the most secure method. The subject alternative name or SAN certificate, or they also call them Unified Communication Certificates, UCC, these certificates are considered better in this regard with regard to security because you specifically list out each of the trusted domain names. And so really when setting up a production Exchange server, security should be a concern, and so you might want to consider going with a SAN certificate or UCC certificate as opposed to a wildcard certificate. When you do go with a SAN certificate or UCC certificate, it's considered best practice to use as few host names as possible. And so that eliminates the excessive amount of work that you have to do on your end to make sure that you have DNS configured for all of these different names and to ensure that the certificate can handle all of the different names. The more names you go with, the greater the cost as well. So typically you can pick up a 5-name certificate and you can go with that for your SAN or UCC certificate, and you try to keep your host names down. So looking at this from a scenario perspective, we are going to jump over to our Exchange server and take a look at the self-signed certificates that we currently have for SpyTech Prime. But in wanting to move SpyTech Prime from a lab environment into a production environment, we've already made the move to allow the server to send and receive email from the server to the internet, and we've already configured it to work with a smart host for the sending of email. We did this in a previous lesson. But now the next step is to configure SpyTech Prime to use a certification authority SAN or UCC certificate from our ISP, which is GoDaddy. So we're going to use GoDaddy as our certification authority. Here's the process that we're going to go through. We're going to use the Exchange Certificate Wizard to obtain a certificate signing request, a CSR. We're going to use that CSR to complete the GoDaddy certificate process. Then we're going to download the certificate from GoDaddy and complete the pending certificate wizard. Then we'll assign the IIS service to the new certificate and demonstrate that it works. Now before we do this, we're going to demonstrate that when we do go to Outlook Web App through our browser, because there is a self-signed certificate, we do get a certification error message. And we'll demonstrate how after we get the certification authority certificate, that error message goes away. Alright, so let's get started. Alright, so we're on our Windows Server 2012 Exchange server, and we already have our certificates up here. You can see we're in the Exchange Admin Center under Servers, that's the feature, and we have selected the Certificates tab. Now from here you can see several certificates already exist. If we select these certificates, you can see here, in each case, these are self-signed certificates. You can see that we have a variety of different ones. You can see in this case, this certificate is assigned to IMAP, POP, IIS, and SMTP services. And you can see that this one is assigned to SMTP services. You'll note that these are self-signed certificates. So in our case, what happens with a self-signed certificate? Well, in a lab environment, there's nothing wrong with having self-signed certificates because you're not so concerned about how this looks from a professional perspective. But let's take a look at what this looks like when you try to access a feature like Outlook Web App. Here, if we open up a new tab, and let's say we use the URL that's been established for this. If we go to https and it's webmail.spytechprime.com Outlook Web App, this is what our people will see. They'll see that there's a problem with the website certificate, and they can click continue to this website. It's not recommended, but they can do it. So they click. They get this big red error thing up at the top, certificate error. Now they can accept the certificate, the self-signed certificate, and they can make this go away. But again, this is not professional. The same is true, as you saw in a previous lesson, when we open up our Outlook on a client. It lets them know, hey, this is going to work for you, but you don't have a valid certificate. It's a self-signed certificate, so yes, it is valid, but it's not a production-oriented certificate. So this is what we see when we're dealing with certificates that are self-signed through the Exchange Admin Center, and they're assigned by default when we install Exchange. So this is why we need to make a change here. We need to get a new certificate and be able to then assign that certificate to our services so that then when folks go to solutions like Outlook Web App or they open up their Outlook, they're not going to see those error messages coming their way. It's just not professional to leave those in a production environment. So, okay, so how do we go about getting a certificate? Well, on the one hand, you have to pay for this certificate through a certificate authority. So in our case, we're using GoDaddy as our certificate authority. They're also the domain registration organization that we used. So it's an easy matchup to go back to them and get our certificate authority certificate. But in order to get that cert, we have to have what they call a CSR. And so the way to do this is we click the plus sign here, and we can get a new Exchange certificate. So now this wizard will create a new certificate, either a self-signed certificate, or it will create a certificate request file, a CRF, that we can then use in order to get our certificate from our certificate authority. So in our case, we already have self-signed certificates. We want to create a request for a certificate from a certification authority. So we click Next, and we'll give it a friendly name. It's always good to make this name as descriptive as possible. So in our case, we'll call it GoDaddy Cert version 1 and click Next. It asks us if we want to request a wildcard certificate, which can be used to secure all subdomains under your root domain with a single certificate. And typically it's not recommended that you use wildcard certificates with Exchange, not with Modern Exchange anyway. So we'll click Next. And here we want to store the request somewhere so that we can then find it later. We're going to store it on this server. We'll click Next. And now here it asks us to specify the domains that we want to have included in our certificate. So if we look through, you can see the variety of different Exchange information here. And here we can see it says specify the domains you want to be included in your certificate. So in our case, there are some that are not specified. Here we have Outlook web app when accessed from the internet. If we open this, we might have this be oamail.spytechprime.com and say OK. Here, OA when accessed from the intranet, we can actually change this because even though this is currently what it uses, we might want to use our webmail and say OK. It's a lot easier for folks to remember webmail than for them to remember POS EX2K1013. So we have these options here. So we have the Outlook address book when accessed from the internet, the Outlook address book when accessed from the intranet. So you can go through and configure all of these different options as far as how to specify it. You see here Exchange Web Services, Exchange Active Sync, Auto Discover. After that, you click Next. Alright, and so from here you can see, based upon our selections, the following domains will be included in our certificate. But it's too many, perhaps, or perhaps we don't want to be concerned with the actual server names in our certificates, so we can remove these, and then we're looking at just the names that we're going to be focused on. And you can go back. Remember, you can go back and make changes to your certificates. You can add additional names to your SAN or UCC certificates in order to make sure you have all of the domain names that you need in your Exchange environment. So in our case, we're just going to focus on the intranet and internet Outlook web app mail, and we have our primary domain name here. One thing to note is that you can see this one's bolded. That's because it is, as you can see here, the common name for this domain. You want to select your primary domain name, the root there for the domain, and change that to the common name. And so now you can see that one's bolded. And then we click Next. It asks us for the organization name, the department name, the country or region name, the city, and state. And we're going to use our US credentials for this, even though the company is based fictitiously in the islands in the Caribbean. We're going to use the United States as our base for this certificate. We click Next. We have to save the certificate to a file, and so in this case, we'll put it right at our C drive and click Finish. And now we can see that that certificate request is here, pending request. So once we have the certificate actually from GoDaddy, we can then complete this request. For now, though, let's go take a look at the certificate request. If we open it with Notepad, here's the certificate request information. Yes, it's supposed to look like that. That might freak you out the first time, but this is what it's supposed to look like, and this is what we're going to paste in to our GoDaddy site in order to get that certificate. So let's open up a new window here. We'll go to our secure socket layer certificates. Here's our SSL certificate. They call it a UCC, but it's also the same as a SAN certificate. And so here, if we click Launch, and then we'll click Request Certificate, Okay, and so here's where we can put in our certificate signing request. What we basically do is we select all of this, select everything, even right to the end new certificate request, right click, click copy, come back over here, paste it in. We'll leave the default third-party or dedicated server. That's where the certificate is going to be hosted. We don't have to add any additional information. The certificate issuing organization is GoDaddy. We click Next. All right, and so here we can see our domain name. We can see all of the information is correct. Third-party hosting, GoDaddy is the certificate issuing organization. Here are our subject alternative names. Now, if we did not choose SpyTech Prime to be the common name, you'll note that if you're doing this in your environments, production or lab, and let's say one of these other names is here for the domain name and SpyTech Prime is down here, well, that's because you did not choose it as the common name that we did earlier in the wizard when you set up the certificate request. So that's just a little glitch. You can always just redo it and get the domain name as the root domain for your organization. So, okay, we're good to go. We click Next. It says you're through. Your certificate will be issued shortly. So we click Finished. And the status is pending. So we'll take a little break and we'll come back and we will check to see when the status is no longer pending and when we can download the certificate, and then we can import that certificate into our Exchange server. And you can see that our status is now current. We can select the certificate and then choose the download option. Here it says select your server type. Notice it doesn't give us Exchange 2013 just yet. That's okay though. We'll choose Exchange 2010 and we'll click download. Let's open up the zip file. Here we can view downloads. And you can see here two different certificates. This is the one that we need to import into our Exchange server. This certificate is also important. It's an intermediate certificate. It's a way of providing proof that GoDaddy is our go-between for our certificate authority. So we're not going to focus on this just yet. We'll just focus on getting our Exchange site up and running. We'll take both of these and we'll copy them out of their zip file. We'll drop it right here at the C drive. That'll just make it easier when we finish the Exchange certificate portion when we jump back over to the Exchange server. So at this point, we're good to go. Let's jump back over to our Exchange Admin Center. All right, and you can see here that we have our GoDaddy cert that's pending request. We can complete the request. To do that, we have to point off to the certificate. So you'll recall we put it right here. There it is. So we'll put in the UNC path. And now we can see our GoDaddy certificate is considered valid. It expires in a year from now, but currently there are no services that have been assigned. But you can see this is not a self-signed certificate. So we have the certificate, but we haven't assigned any services over to it. So to do that, if we just double-click the cert, and we go to Services, here we can select the services that we want to assign. So for the sake of our demonstration here, we'll just assign the IIS service to it for now, and we'll leave these other services off of the selection. We can select them at any time. We can come back and make changes to this. We'll click Save. And now we go back over to Outlook Web App. Let's just close this one out. Open up a new Outlook Web App. And notice we get no error when it comes to the certificate. Everything's still clear up here. We can log in without a problem. And as you can see, we're good to go. We no longer have any certificate issues. We have no more red boxes up in here, no certificate errors. So everything is working just fine. If we go back to certificates, we could obviously take this certificate and now apply it to SMTP services, or really any of the other services that we see being handled by our self-signed certificates. We can now move them over to the valid certificate. So let's just jump in there and do that. And as you can see, we had a problem with our certificate here because we were using the POS EX2K13 server name, and that's not part of our certificate. So we had to go and use the actual URL that we put in for our certificate in order for us not to have a certificate error up here at the top. So that's fine. That's actually better for us instead of using the server name. Granted, internally it's easier, and when you're working on the server it's easier, but it's good to get used to using the URLs, because that's one of the values of using the Exchange Admin Center, is that you don't have to install the tools on each system. You can use the URL to access the admin tools from anywhere. So we're looking at a valid certificate. The only other thing that is worth mentioning is that if you have multiple Exchange servers, you have to perform this process for multiple servers. And so there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can repeat the process and bring the certificate over if you're going to install the certificate on multiple systems. You'll note, though, if we click the three dots here, we can export the Exchange certificate and then import the Exchange certificate on another server. So that's not something we're going to need to do in our situation. We only have the one Exchange server, but it's good to know that this is possible, that you can export and import Exchange certificates. So you can see it's not that it's a nightmare to accomplish this. There are a lot of steps, and it involves working with your ISP, your certification authority, in order to provide the proper certificates and make this all work. But in the end, it's really just that there are a lot of steps involved. And with many steps, there's obviously a lot of room for error. So hopefully by seeing this and seeing how it's supposed to work smoothly, it gives you a little bit more confidence so that when you have to do it in your production environment, you don't have that fear of the unknown because you've just seen it done. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.